The quiet hum of the house was a sound he had come to despise. It was the sound of a life being lived for him, not by him. At 93, Abram had learned to distinguish between the silence of solitude and the silence of irrelevance. Here, in his son Daniel's meticulously kept home, he was irrelevant. He sat in the chair they had placed for him by the window, a heavy quilt over his knees despite the warmth of the afternoon. From this perch, he was meant to watch the world go by, a passive observer to the seasons of a life that was no longer his own. They thought his hearing was the first thing to fade, a convenient assumption that allowed their conversations to flow freely around him, as if he were a stone in a stream. But his ears were still sharp enough to catch the words that mattered, the words that called in his gut like a cold snake. The facility in town, his daughter-in-law, Sarah, had whispered to Daniel in the kitchen that morning, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "They have an opening. Dr. Miller says it's for the best." He could fall again. Abram did not flinch. He kept his gaze fixed on the perfectly manicured lawn outside, on the neat rows of flowers that seemed to stand at attention. He had fallen, yes. A simple misstep on the porch had become the catalyst for his own undoing, the evidence they needed to prove his incompetence. They saw a frail old man, a collection of fragile bones and paper-thin skin. They did not see the fire that still burned behind his pale blue eyes, a low, stubborn ember that had refused to be extinguished by time or sorrow. They saw the tremor in his hands but not the unwavering strength of his will. That morning, after they thought he had drifted off in his chair, he had carefully, painstakingly, retrieved the old leather-bound book from his bedside table. Tucked within its yellowed pages was a map, drawn not with ink but with memory and charcoal by his own father's hand nearly a century ago. It was a map to a place they had forgotten, a place they believed had been swallowed by the forest and time itself. A place he knew was still waiting. The conversation in the kitchen continued, a soft drone of concern and logistics, the careful planning of his final surrender. "It will be safer, Pa," Daniel had told him last week, his hand resting on Abram's shoulder with a weight that was meant to be comforting but felt like an anchor. "People to look after you around the clock." Abram had only nodded, his silence mistaken for acquiescence. But in that silence, a plan was taking root, a final, quiet rebellion against the tyranny of their love. He would not end his days in a clean, sterile room, waiting for polite strangers to bring him his meals. He would not become a story they told with sad, shaking heads. He had made a promise long ago, under a canopy of stars so vast it stole the breath, and he intended to keep it. He was a rancher, a man of the earth, and he would return to the only place that had ever truly been his, the only place they could never find him. He would go home. His body was a traitor, a slow, aching vessel that protested every small movement. Yet, within its confines, his mind was a fortress. Each morning, Abram undertook the small rituals of existence with a deliberation that bordered on ceremony. He shaved with a straight razor his own father had used, his hand surprisingly steady for the task, his eyes focused in the small, polished metal sheet he used as a mirror. He dressed himself in the worn, comfortable clothes his son's wife wished he would discard, the sturdy denim and faded flannel a testament to a life of work, not of waiting. As he buttoned his shirt, his fingers brushed against the worn fabric, and a memory surfaced, as clear and sharp as the morning air. It was Martha, his wife, her hands working a needle and thread to mend this very shirt by the light of a kerosene lamp. Her face, framed by silver hair, was etched with a love so profound it had become the bedrock of his world. They had been sitting on the porch of their own ranch, the one Daniel had sold after she passed, the chirping of crickets the only sound for miles. "You must never let them put you in a box, Abram," she had said, not looking up from her work. Her voice was soft, but the words carried the weight of a sacred vow. "Promise me. This land, our life, it doesn't end in a room with 4 blank walls. You go to the mountain. You go back to where it all began." He had placed his hand over hers, stilling the needle. "I promise, Martha. I'll die with my boots on." Looking at the sky, the memory was so vivid he could almost smell the night-blooming jasmine she had planted by the porch steps. It wasn't just a memory, it was a mandate. Daniel and Sarah, in their earnest, suffocating care, believed they were honoring him. They couldn't understand that they were dismantling the very man he was, piece by piece. They spoke of safety, but what he craved was dignity. They offered comfort, but what he needed was purpose. The old place, the cabin his father had raised with his own 2 hands deep in the forested hills, was more than a structure of wood and stone. It was the genesis of his family's story, the heart from which everything had grown. He remembered his father, a man as rugged and unyielding as the landscape itself, teaching him how to read the signs of the wilderness. He had shown him the hidden spring that never ran dry, the sheltered hollows where the deer took refuge in winter, the quiet strength of the ancient pines. That cabin was not an escape, it was a destination. It was the final chapter of a story he intended to write himself. He finished dressing and walked slowly to the kitchen, his gnarled hands gripping the smooth banister for support. Sarah had left a bowl of oatmeal for him on the table, a perfectly portioned meal for a man they believed could no longer be trusted with his own sustenance. He ate it slowly, methodically, gathering the strength he would soon need, the promise to Martha echoing in the silent chambers of his heart. The confrontation he had been dreading arrived that evening, wrapped in the gentle tones of reason. Daniel sat opposite him at the large dining table, a space meant for family feasts that now felt like an interrogation room. Sarah hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her face a portrait of anxious concern. "Pa," Daniel began, his voice soft, practiced. "We need to talk about the future." Abram looked at his son, a man in his prime, with strong hands and a kind heart, yet a man who had forgotten the lessons of his own grandfather. He saw the city in Daniel, the softening that came from a life of predictable comforts and ordered streets. He had lost the wildness, the resilience that the land demanded. "I'm not going," Abram said. His voice was raspy from disuse, but the words were firm, each one a stone laid in a defensive wall. Daniel sighed, a long, weary exhalation. "Pa, please. Try to understand. This is about your safety. The Northwood residence is a wonderful place. There are doctors, other people your age. You won't be so alone." The irony was a bitter taste in Abram's mouth. He had never felt more alone than he did in this crowded, bustling house, surrounded by people who saw him as a problem to be solved. "I am not a horse to be put out to pasture, Daniel," he said, his gaze unwavering. "My life is my own. You don't get to decide when it's over." The conversation circled, a vulture over a dying animal. They spoke of his health, of their worries, of their love for him. Every word was a thread in the net they were weaving around him, a cage built of good intentions. He listened, his silence growing deeper, more profound. It was a silence they mistook for confusion, for the stubbornness of old age. They could not see that it was the quiet of a man gathering his resolve, a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. He watched them, studying their rhythms, their patterns. He knew Daniel left for the mercantile every Tuesday and Friday, a 2-hour round trip. He knew Sarah visited with the ladies of the church on Wednesday afternoons. These were the cracks in the walls of his comfortable prison, the small windows of opportunity he needed. He thought of his father's words, spoken to him as a young boy while they tracked a buck through the deep woods. "The world will always try to corral you, son. It'll build fences of fear and expectation. The trick is to know the land so well that you can always find the gate." His gate was opening. He just had to be patient enough, and strong enough, to walk through it when the time came. That night, lying in the too-soft bed, he stared into the darkness and saw not the ceiling of his son's house, but the star-dusted sky above the pine trees of his youth. He was not afraid. He was preparing. The plan was a quiet, secret thing, assembled piece by piece in the shadowed corners of the house. It began with the satchel, an old leather bag of his that had been relegated to the back of a dusty closet. He retrieved it one afternoon while Sarah was in the garden, its familiar weight in his hand a comfort. Over the next week, he became a scavenger in the home that was supposed to be his own. Each small acquisition was a victory, a piece of his reclaimed freedom. From the pantry, he took a small cloth sack of dried beans and a tin of salted beef, hiding them at the bottom of the satchel beneath a spare wool shirt. He found a small, sharp utility knife in a drawer in the tool shed, its edge still keen. He wrapped it in an oilcloth and tucked it away. The most crucial items were the flint and steel. They were part of a decorative set on the mantelpiece, an artifact of a bygone era that Sarah thought added a rustic charm to her modern living space. To Abram, they were life. He waited until the house was empty, his heart a slow, steady drum against his ribs. His hands, which shook when lifting a cup of tea, were perfectly still as he took the flint and steel from their place. He held them in his palm, the cold, hard reality of them a grounding force. He was not just remembering his past, he was actively reaching for it. He gathered a small bundle of kindling from the woodpile out back, slivers of dry pine that would catch a spark easily. Every object he collected was a link in a chain pulling him toward the mountains. He supplemented his cache with a small coil of sturdy rope, a tin cup, and the heavy wool blanket from the foot of his bed. He packed them all with the careful precision of a man who understood that what you carried determined how far you could go. As he worked, his mind drifted back, weaving the past into the present. He saw his father, sitting by a campfire, showing him how to find north using the stars. He heard his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder. Nature provides everything a man needs, but she doesn't hand it over. You have to know how to ask. You have to know how to look. His father had prepared him for this his entire life, without ever knowing it. He had taught him not just how to survive in the wilderness, but how to belong to it. He had taught him that true wealth wasn't in a deed or a bank account, but in the knowledge of the land, in the ability to stand on your own 2 feet under God's sky and provide for yourself. Daniel and Sarah saw his quietness as a sign of decline. They couldn't imagine the intricate world alive in his mind, the maps he was reviewing, the strategies he was forming. They saw an old man in a chair, but he was a general planning his campaign. The final piece was the note. He wouldn't just disappear. That would be cruel, and his rebellion was not born of cruelty, but of love for a life they no longer understood. He would leave them a message, a final testament. He practiced the words in his head, simple, direct, and true. He would not apologize. He would not explain. He would simply state his intent, a declaration of independence written in the shaky but resolute hand of a 93-year-old man who had decided to choose his own ending. The day was a Wednesday. The air was cool and crisp, with the scent of pine carried on the breeze from the distant hills. It was a perfect day for walking. Sarah had left an hour earlier for her church gathering, her farewell a cheerful, oblivious wave from the doorway. Daniel was at the mercantile, procuring supplies for the week. The house settled into a deep, humming silence, the kind Abram had been waiting for. It was time. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a man who knew he had no moments to waste but refused to be hurried by panic. He went to his room and retrieved the packed satchel from beneath his bed. It was heavier than he expected, a dense, promising weight. He slung it over his shoulder, the leather strap creaking softly. On the perfectly made bed, atop the pristine quilt, he placed the note. It was written on a page torn from the back of the old book, the charcoal letters stark against the yellowed paper. It read, "I am going home. Do not follow. I lived my life on my own terms. I will end it the same way." Abram, he read it one last time, the words a final, unarguable truth. He felt no guilt, only a profound sense of rightness, of a compass needle finding its true north after years of spinning. He walked through the house one last time, a ghost in his own life. He didn't look at the photographs on the walls or the comfortable furniture. They were artifacts from a life that was no longer his. His home was waiting for him, a place of memory and solitude, a place of stone and wood and earth. He opened the back door, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the silence. The sunlight was bright, and he paused on the threshold, letting its warmth soak into his old bones. He took a deep breath of the free air, a scent untainted by polish or soap. Then, he stepped outside and pulled the door gently shut behind him. He did not look back. He walked past the manicured garden, past the neat fences, and toward the tree line at the edge of the property. The first few hundred yards were the hardest. His legs, accustomed to the flat, even floors of the house, protested the uneven ground. His lungs burned with the effort. Every part of his body screamed at him to turn back, to return to the safety and comfort of the chair by the window. but the image of Martha's face, the echo of his promise, and the memory of his father's lessons propelled him forward. He found a sturdy, fallen branch and, with his knife, trimmed it into a walking staff. Leaning on it, he found a rhythm, a slow, shuffling gait that ate up the distance with surprising efficiency. He was no longer a burden. He was a traveler. With each step he took into the deepening woods, the suffocating hum of his son's house faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird, and the steady, reassuring beat of his own determined heart. The forest welcomed him like an old friend. As he moved deeper under the canopy of pine and oak, the world of manicured lawns and silent judgment dissolved behind him. Here, the rules were simpler, more honest. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. This was a language he understood. His journey was not a straight line but a meandering path dictated by the lay of the land and the limits of his own aging body. He walked for an hour, then rested for 20 minutes, his back against the rough bark of an ancient tree. He drank sparingly from the canteen he had filled at his son's well, conserving the water. He ate a small piece of the salted beef, the flavor intense, grounding. This was not the bland, soft food of his recent life, this was fuel. This was sustenance. He navigated not by a map on paper, but by the one etched into his soul. He knew this land. He recognized the sharp incline of Miller's Ridge, the way the creek curved around the base of the weeping willows, the cluster of granite boulders that looked like sleeping giants. These were the landmarks of his youth, unchanged by the passage of decades. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a primal fear, cold and sharp, tried to work its way into his heart. He would be alone, in the dark, in a wilderness that was home to predators both four-legged and two. But then he remembered his father's teaching. Fear was a choice. Preparation was a defense. He found a small, sheltered alcove between two large rocks, a natural barrier against the wind. He gathered dry leaves and pine needles, creating a small, insulated bed. He would not risk a fire on his first night. The smoke could be seen. He was a fugitive, after all, a fugitive from a loving prison. He sat in the growing twilight, the satchel clutched in his lap, and listened to the forest come alive with the sounds of the night. The hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig in the distance, the whisper of the wind through the high branches. He was not an intruder here. He was a part of it, a returning native. He thought of Daniel and Sarah, imagined their panic when they found the note. A pang of sorrow, sharp and quick, pierced his resolve. He had caused them pain, and that had not been his intention. But the alternative, the slow erosion of his spirit in that quiet, humming house, was a pain far greater. He was doing this not to hurt them, but to save himself. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin, the familiar scratchiness a comfort. Lying there, on the hard ground, with the immense, star-dusted sky visible through the branches above, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He was cold, he was tired, and every muscle in his body ached, but he was free. His transformation had begun. He was no longer Abram, the old man. He was Abram, the survivor. And tomorrow, he would walk again. He awoke before the dawn, his body stiff and protesting, but his mind clear. The grey, pre-dawn light filtered through the trees, soft and ethereal. He ate another small portion of dried beef and drank from his canteen before setting off, using the first light to continue his journey. The terrain grew more difficult, the incline steeper, the forest thicker. He moved at a pace that would have shamed his younger self, a slow, methodical crawl through the wilderness. But he was not racing against anything. He was moving toward something. He was moving toward home. By late afternoon on the second day, he found it. He smelled it before he saw it, the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and thyme, of the cold stone from the chimney. He crested a small rise, pushing aside a curtain of low-hanging branches, and there it was. The cabin stood in a small clearing, looking smaller and more weathered than he remembered, as if the forest were slowly, patiently reclaiming it. The roof sagged in the middle, and the door hung crookedly on a single leather hinge. A thick carpet of moss grew on the north-facing wall, and vines snaked their way up the chimney. To another eye, it would have been a ruin, a sad relic of a forgotten time. To Abram, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was his sanctuary. He walked slowly into the clearing, his walking staff thumping softly on the packed earth. The silence here was different. It was not the empty silence of his son's house, but a deep, resonant silence, full of the history of the lives lived within those walls. He pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cool. A single room, with a large stone hearth dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table and two small stools were the only furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. A shaft of light from a crack in the roof illuminated a constellation of dust motes dancing in the air. The smell was overwhelming, a potent mix of old wood, cold ashes, damp earth, and something else, something intangible, the scent of memory itself. He could almost see his mother, a younger woman than he had ever been, humming as she swept the floor with a broom made of birch twigs. He could almost hear his father's booming laugh echoing off the timbered walls. This was not a house. It was a vessel, and it was filled with the ghosts he loved. He dropped his satchel on the floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was almost debilitating, washed over him. He had made it. He had come home. But the work was just beginning. He couldn't afford to rest. With the remaining daylight, he began the process of reclaiming his life. First, water. He followed the faint trail behind the cabin, his feet remembering the way, until he found the spring, just as his father had described it. It was a small pool of crystal-clear water, bubbling up from between two stones, cold and pure. He knelt and drank deeply, the water a balm to his parched throat and weary spirit. Then, he returned to the cabin and began the slow, arduous task of making it habitable. He swept the floor with a pine bough, sending clouds of dust into the air. He gathered wood for the hearth, his movements practiced and efficient. As dusk fell, he knelt before the cold, dark hearth, just as his father had taught him. He struck the flint against the steel, and on the third try, a spark caught in the tinder. He blew on it gently, coaxing it, nurturing it, until a small, hesitant flame flickered to life. It grew, casting a warm, dancing light across the room, pushing back the shadows and the chill. He sat on the floor, watching the fire, the first fire he had made for himself in over a decade. It was a small, simple thing, but it was a profound declaration. He was not just surviving. He was living. The days settled into a rhythm ancient and deeply satisfying. Abram's life was no longer measured by the ticking of a clock on the wall but by the slow, majestic passage of the sun across the sky. He woke with the first light, his body aching but his purpose clear. He was the sole keeper of this small kingdom, and it demanded his full attention. His first task each morning was to fetch water from the spring, the tin cup cool against his lips. Then, he would tend the fire, the heart of his new life, ensuring the embers from the night before were coaxed back into a steady flame. His meals were simple, a handful of boiled beans, a piece of dried meat, and later, as his confidence grew, foraged goods from the forest floor. He rediscovered the plants his father had taught him about, the tart sorrel that grew by the creek, the nutty flavor of roasted cattail roots, the earthy taste of wild mushrooms he knew to be safe. Each small meal was a feast, earned through knowledge and effort. The cabin itself became his primary occupation. He used his knife and the coil of rope to fashion a new hinge for the door, allowing it to swing shut and offer a barrier against the night. He spent an entire afternoon patching the hole in the roof, weaving a lattice of branches and packing it with a mixture of mud and dried moss. It was clumsy work, his hands stiff and uncooperative, but when the next rain came, the spot above his sleeping area remained dry. It was a triumph more satisfying than any accomplishment from his previous life. He felt his body changing. The softness that had accumulated during his years of inactivity began to harden. His muscles, though old, grew stronger with use. The tremor in his hands lessened when he was focused on a task. He was still a 93-year-old man, but he no longer felt like one. He felt timeless, a part of the enduring landscape. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. It was in these quiet moments that he felt the presence of his wife and father most acutely. He didn't see them as ghosts, but as companions, their wisdom a quiet hum in the back of his mind. He would speak to Martha sometimes, his voice a low murmur in the silent cabin. "You were right," he'd say to the flickering flames. "A man needs work. He needs a reason to greet the sun." He contrasted this life of meaningful hardship with the one he had left behind. At Daniel's house, his days had been a series of passive events, being woken, being fed, being sat in a chair, being put to bed. He was an object to be cared for. Here, he was the agent of his own existence. Every drop of water he drank, every piece of wood that warmed him, every bite of food he ate was a direct result of his own labor. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials, and in that simplicity, he found a profound and unexpected joy. He was not waiting to die. He was busy living. He knew they would come. It was inevitable. He had been at the cabin for nearly 3 weeks when he saw the first sign, a freshly broken branch on the game trail that led to his clearing. They were clumsy, unused to moving through the woods without leaving a trace. He felt a strange mix of apprehension and calm. The confrontation he had fled was now coming to him, but this time, it would be on his terms, on his land. 2 days later, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. It was Daniel. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of exhaustion, relief, and utter disbelief. He looked around the clearing, at the neatly stacked firewood, the patched roof, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He was seeing not a ruin, but a home. Abram was sitting on a log near his fire, stirring a small pot of bean stew. He didn't get up. He simply watched his son approach, his heart a slow, steady beat. "Pa!" Daniel's voice was a choked whisper. He walked closer, his eyes taking in his father's appearance. Abram was thinner, his face more weathered, his clothes smudged with dirt and ash, but his eyes were clear and bright, more alive than Daniel had seen them in years. "Pa, what in God's name were you thinking?" The anger and worry finally broke through. "We've been searching for weeks. We thought you were dead. You could have frozen, or starved, or been attacked by a bear." Abram looked up from his stew, his expression calm, unreadable. He gestured with his spoon toward the other end of the log. "Sit down, Daniel. The stew is almost ready." Daniel stared, flabbergasted. He had expected to find a shivering, half-dead old man, a tragic victim of dementia. He had not expected to find a homesteader, calmly preparing his supper. He sank onto the log, burying his face in his hands for a moment before looking up again, his eyes pleading. "You have to come back with me. Now." "This is madness." It was then that Abram finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the unshakable weight of conviction. No, he looked directly at his son, and for the first time, Daniel saw not his frail, aging father, but the powerful, resolute man he remembered from his childhood. "I was dying back there, son," Abram said, his voice even. "Not from a fall or a sickness. I was dying from the quiet. From the waiting. I was dying from being useless. Every day, you and Sarah, with the best of intentions, you took another piece of me away. You took my work, my choices, my purpose. You left me with nothing to do but sit in a chair and wait for the end." From the edge of the clearing, Sarah appeared, her hand over her mouth. She had been hanging back, afraid of what they might find. She listened now, her expression shifting from fear to a dawning, painful understanding. Abram continued, his gaze never leaving his son. "Out here, every single thing I do matters. The fire keeps me warm. The water keeps me alive. The roof keeps me dry. I am not waiting for anything. I am living. Can you understand that?" Daniel looked around the clearing again, his city-softened eyes truly seeing for the first time. He saw the repaired door, the carefully tended fire pit, the small pile of edible roots near the cabin wall. This wasn't the act of a confused old man, it was the work of a deeply competent one. He looked at his father, at the strength in his posture, the clarity in his eyes, and the shame hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been so focused on his father's fragility that he had completely overlooked his strength. He had tried to protect the body while allowing the spirit to wither and die. I was scared, Pa, Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. After you fell, all I could think about was losing you. I thought a safe place was the best way to love you. Abram reached out and placed a gnarled, dirt-stained hand on his son's arm. The touch was surprisingly firm. Love isn't about building a cage, no matter how comfortable it is. Love is about letting a person be who they are. Your grandfather built this place with his bare hands. He taught me how to live on this land, how to be a man who depends on himself. That's who I am, Daniel. It's all I've ever been. Taking that away from me is like taking the wings from a hawk. It might still be alive, but it can no longer fly. Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. We were so wrong, Abram. We just didn't see. Abram gave her a small, weary smile. You saw an old man. It's an easy mistake to make. But I had to remember the man I was. I had to come back here to find him again. An understanding passed between them, a silent agreement that transcended words. The battle was over. There would be no more talk of facilities, no more attempts to force him back into a life that didn't fit. They stayed for another hour, sharing Abram's simple stew from the tin cup. They talked more than they had in years, not about ailments and safety, but about the land, about memories of Daniel's grandmother, about the future. A new arrangement was made, a compromise born of respect and newfound understanding. Daniel would not force him to leave. Instead, he would return once a week, leaving a sack of supplies, flour, salt, beans, maybe some bacon, at the edge of the clearing. He would not intrude on his father's solitude, but he would ensure he had the staples he couldn't forage for himself. It was a perfect treaty, one that honored Abram's independence while easing his children's hearts. As Daniel and Sarah prepared to leave, the sun dipping below the horizon, Daniel turned to his father one last time. Are you happy here, Pa? Truly? Abram looked at the cabin, its rough-hewn walls glowing in the warm light of the setting sun. He looked at the vast, silent forest that surrounded him, a kingdom of his own making. I am home, son, he said, and it was the only answer that mattered. He watched them disappear back into the trees, their figures swallowed by the twilight. He was alone again, but he was not lonely. He banked the fire for the night and went inside his small, imperfect, perfect home. He lay down on his bed of pine boughs, pulling the wool blanket over him. Outside, the stars began to appear, cold and bright in the endless sky. He was 93 years old, and he had won. He had not run from death, he had run toward life, and he had found it here, in the quiet heart of the woods, on his own terms.